Hello again. So I fully realize that I'm the one standing between you and getting out and experiencing the rest of your Saturday. They're not you could totally there's the door. I'm not really literally in between you and leaving, but thanks for staying. I sure do appreciate it. So we talked a good bit about this morning around just Flexbox in general, how all those things worked. So now we're going to dig in and talk about some more hands-on responsive examples. But before we dig into the responsive bits, let's talk a little bit, really quick, about design systems and how they work, and hopefully kind of adjust how we view approaching modular design and handling some of these more complex design patterns that we need to be able to do in a responsive type situation. So, patterns in design systems. You hear a lot about that, especially in the last year and a half. The folks, everybody's creating one. The folks at Salesforce, anybody who's anybody is creating a design system and sticking it on GitHub so that we can all consume it and be a little bit jealous, I guess. So the challenge, I think, in building websites, and more particularly really complex applications, is that maintaining those is becoming increasingly more difficult. So one of the things that we get with Flexbox is a new level of control around the systems that we're trying to create, how we lay out components or modules, and it overcomes some of the hacky things that we talked about this morning around floating and clear fixing and just all this weird stuff that we've been trying to do over the past handful of years to try and create these applications or these interfaces. So this moves us kind of a nice step forward in modernizing the web just a little bit more. Now, there's still a little bit of a gap between how we currently build things and how we'll build things in the future. And the future's becoming closer and closer, as it tends to do. So we've gone through kind of the boxy primer around Flexbox. So towards the end, or I guess towards the last, 75% of this, we're going to really dig in on what I hope are practical examples around Flexbox and how it works. And you're going to notice that it's not very media query heavy because of the way Flexbox works. So it should be fun. So benefits, really quick, on thinking about design systems or applications in kind of the smallest usable chunks or reusable chunks. When you begin to think about an application or a website, less so as a series of pages and more so just around this page has 15 modules or 15 components, and those components are reused in various other locations. It begins to change how we approach design and how we approach development. So some really basic guidelines that we try and enforce lightly on the projects that we work on as a company is one of the most important things that we try and do is try and collaborate better between our UX folks, our designers, our developers, because you are trying to build this cohesive design system. And you can't do that if you have the designers sitting in a silo and then handing things over to a developer. All these individuals need to be able to work together so they can solidify the overall design system. One of the things that does is it helps foster consistency. So if you're working on a smaller website, it's not that big of a deal. If you're working on these larger, complex, enterprise-y type applications where you have numerous designers and numerous developers working in a code base or multiple code bases that are sharing the same types of components, it becomes a challenge in scale. How do you take that component, that thing that you're designing or developing, so that you can reuse that in multiple locations? One of the things that building a design system we're focusing on this smaller version of what you're building does is it helps foster consistency with the team. A challenge that we face a lot as we're training clients or even with our own team is trying to keep the system up to date. Now that's another talk in and of itself. But it's important to do that because once your design system, kind of your single source of truth for those patterns is out of date, it's not very useful anymore. So keep those up to date. And then, once you do all those things, enjoy being efficient and productive because it frees you up so you're not doing the same things over and over and over again. They're done, they're tested, you can focus on solving the real problems, like centering things vertically and horizontally, right? No, we already solved that, right, this morning. We're totally good. So some conventions that are around. Now, there are numerous conventions around folder structure, naming conventions around creating a module or a component. There's smacks from your own fellow Canadian Jonathan Snook, which is one of my personal faves on kind of how you approach building design systems at Yahoo. There's BIM. Anybody use BIM? I have a love-hate relationship with it, but I'm kind of moving closer to that direction. So BIM is a pretty good one, especially, it's great if you're working with a large team, right? Even if you don't align to that specific way of naming something, it makes it really easy if the whole team is doing that, because you can just jump in and out, and it all makes a lot more sense. There are things like object-oriented CSS, inverted triangle CSS, O2, object-oriented CSS. So there are a handful of conventions that are out there. And the challenge with designing for the web today is that there are lots of options everywhere, from frameworks to preprocessors to naming conventions. So the best that I could tell you to do is just pick one. Like, pick one that you think you kind of like, find something that works for you. If you work on a large team, find something that works for the team. Like, you can't be doing something one way and somebody else doing something another way and somebody else doing something another way. It's going to make this whole process of trying to create these responsive components very difficult. So find a convention that works for you and for your team so that you can be productive together. So if I'm doing a really light website, I might do something like this. If I'm doing an application, the folder structure is going to be very different, like very, very different. So keep that in mind. Naming conventions, I'm a simple guy, so I tend to follow a couple different ones pretty consistently. One is kind of a parent-grandchild naming convention, and it will look kind of like that. So you have a parent, child, grandchild, just hyphenated. If I was using that in real life for navigation, it might look something like that. Now, the pros of that design, or that naming convention, is that it makes the relationship clear between the parent and its children or its grandchildren. And it makes it a little bit easier to name grandchildren objects. Now, the challenge with that specific convention is they can get kind of long. So you want to be careful how you're naming things. The other one that I follow a good bit is this plural singular naming convention. It's common in the rel space. So it might look something like that if I'm writing classes. Now, I dig that because it maintains the relationship between the parent and the child. So I don't know. That's what works for me. I'm not saying that you have to use it, but I totally dig it. But find something that works for you. So all that said, let's talk about patterns and dig into a little bit of Flexbox. So patterns, the idea is that we're essentially taking a holistic view of the application or the website that we're trying to create, and we're breaking that down into its smallest functional components. That becomes our module or component or pattern, whatever you want to call it. So we're going to take a look at, I think 10 or so patterns, how they work with Flexbox and responsive, and work a little bit of magic and see what happens. So patterns, I think, are really important. Now today, if you haven't seen this on Twitter, it made me giggle just a little bit. Essentially, people are designing two types of websites. It's that one or that one, and that's kind of what you see. And you know, I think it's important to design in this type of way because it drives consistency. Now, all that said, just because everything looks like this on Dribbble doesn't mean you have to follow those conventions, right? So it's okay to be a little bit different in what we're designing. Okay, so we've seen this before if you were here this morning, slightly adjusted. Now what we have is a typical application type layout, right? We have a header, we have a sidebar, we have a content area, we have a footer. If I was going to write the HTML for that, I might get something kind of like this. I have a header, I have a main. The main is that section in the middle. and that contains my article, which is my core content, and my sidebar that would have complementary stuff, right? And then we have a footer. Typical stuff. Now, what we want is on mobile, if we did what we typically do, taking a responsive design and squishing that down, our aside is going to be down there. Now, if I want to move that sidebar above, let's say that I'm doing like an Amazon type application, and I have a whole bunch of filters that were living in my sidebar, but I don't want those down there below. I want those above. There are a couple ways that I can do that. I can either change my source order, so that means that I'm going to have all this navigation-y stuff above my article, and if I'm on a screen reader or something weird like that, I'm going to have to click through or go through a whole bunch of nonsense that I don't really care about. I want the content first. So that's why the content is above the sidebar, because we want to serve the content above anything else, right? Relatively. So what I want to do is take my little aside down there. I want to bump it up above. Right. All right, we're done. No. So if I was going to write that in CSS, this is kind of what it would take to do it. So on my body, I'm not doing like a wrapping container class. I'm just using my body to keep it simple. I'm telling my body that I want it to be flex, right? So display flex to keep things from bumping up against each other in rows, remember. We're going to set our flight direction for column, so everything goes full width. And then for my container, now again, the container is the red area and the square below that. I just need to tell that to display flex, and you'll see why here in a moment. I'm doing some things I'm going to use on desktop just in case. And then the only thing that I'm really doing is I'm using order. And I'm just telling it that I want that aside to show above my content. And that's kind of how I do that. Now, when I go back to desktop, in order to make that work, I just do a very simple media query. So we're doing mobile first, right? So as it expands out, my aside goes back to the side like it's supposed to. So to do that, there are a few ways I could do it. I could change the order again and rewrite that in my sidebar, or I can just use flex direction and I can reverse the row, right? So it's just going to flip it around. And then what I'm using for that is giving you a flex basis to set the width. Pattern number 2. I'm going to lose count somewhere in the middle of these, so I'm going to stop counting. So typical header, right? So we might have a logo, we might have some core links for the application. On the other side of that, we would have like user settings or logout or user profile with a rounded icon. That's the pattern, right, that we see a lot. If I was going to write the HTML for that, I might kind of do something like this. I might not. I'm feeling iffy about it now, but that's kind of what we get. So I have a toolbars container, and in that I have toolbar. So I have 2 toolbars. One for my application navigation, one for my user navigation, and there's just some stuff in there that's not too terribly important. Now, what I want to do is to be able to, a couple things. On desktop, I want one to one side, one on the other. Now, if I'm doing this the way we do it now, I'm going to have to float one to the left, float one to the right, use a clear fix, and that's kind of how it works. On mobile, I'll have to unfloat things or float things afterwards to give me something like that if I'm going down to a mobile device and doing kind of a hamburger-y type drop-down menu. And I don't really want to use floats. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to start with mobile first to give me something kind of like that. So in the toolbars, the wrapping container, again, we display flex a lot, so I'm going to stop saying that now. And then we're going to use flex direction again just to make everything full width. So when I go to desktop, I do a media query. Now the media query, we're going to change our flex direction. So right, we have our children of the Flexbox would be columns, right, all the way down. So we're going to change that back to the default setting, which is to tell them that we want them all to be in the same row. So we do that there with flex direction row. Now, instead of trying to move it to the left, move it to the right, we're going to use our fancy justify content, and we're going to set that to space between. So what that's, since there are only 2 children inside of this, it's going to make it really easy for us to do it. It's going to take the first one, move it to the left, the next one, move it to the right, and it's going to justify the content in between, and it gives us a really simple way to create that type of layout. And then just for good measure, on our toolbar, we're aligning the items to the center. So what that's going to do, regardless of the height of that toolbar wrapper, it's going to make sure that the links inside are always displayed horizontally. I have to think about that too. Horizontal, vertical, horizon. So it makes sure that everything's displayed horizontally. Easy enough? So there's a second way that we see those types of navigations and applications. One's kind of a header. The other one is something kind of like that, where we have our sidebar, right? And in our sidebar, we have the core application links, and then for whatever reason, folks like to bump down the user settings and the logout at the bottom of that little pane, or the bottom of the sidebar. So we'll use similar HTML. We changed the classes, but the HTML structure is essentially the same. So it's a bit more contextual around the actual component that we've created. And the CSS to make that work is just 3 lines of code, right? Not a lot to it. We're using the exact same CSS that we used on the horizontal version, with the exception of our flex direction. We're leaving that as column, and our justified content is still spaced between. Fancy, right? Really light stuff. So if we were doing this in normal CSS, one of the things that we would have to do is set that parent container more than likely with a relative position, so that the stuff that we're sticking on the bottom, we'd have to set that to absolute and stick that to the bottom left corner or something like that. Now the challenge with doing that with floats or positioning is that if our core application navigation is too long, anything that we have positioned is going to overlay it. Now, doing this with Flexbox, it's just going to cause it to bump down, because it's not overlaying anything, it's just taking up the extra space, and if there's not extra space, it's going to bump it down, and we get a typical scroll like we would expect. Okay, this is one that I run into a good bit, where we typically have some type of a primary heading, and then we have a secondary somewhere off to the side. This can be contextual information, this could be some type of toolbar, some type of contextual action that I can do on a section of content or a section in the application. Again, I'm using CSS or HTML kind of like that. So the challenge, if I was to do that layout in floats, or positioning, so the first one would be position, where I have the primary heading just sitting up there like it normally would. I have the secondary position to the right-hand side. Whenever that screen resizes, the secondary is going to overlap the primary. And that's kind of a pain to deal with. If I did that in floats, whenever it resizes, it's going to bump the secondary down underneath, and it's going to look weird. Now, I could do a media query, and whenever it got small, I could tell the secondary heading that instead of floating it right, float to the left. And that would kind of be okay. But one thing that it doesn't take into account is the length of the primary heading. So if it's too long, it's really hard to kind of finagle that media query to make it work. So it drops down the secondary heading. So we don't want to do that. We have Flexbox, so we're going to use that. So this is really what I want to have happen whenever that heading decreases. So to write that, that's what I do. Don't do any media queries. Set it to flex. Now in this case, I'm aligning items to flex end, and then I'm telling it to wrap. So on the primary heading, I want that to grow as tall as it can, or wide as it can. So what happens then when the screen decreases is it just bumps my secondary heading down. And it just kind of works. It's weird. But that's how it works. Okay, another example similar to that. We use this concept a lot where we have a basic CRUD interface, and there's a list or an item or an array of things that we want to work with. And CRUD-wise, we can view it, we can edit it, we can delete it, we can do. The challenge is if we have something like this is an example of user actions. So we have an array of users, and then with those users there are a handful of actions. If the screen is too small, typically we would either float or position. We have the same issues we would have with our heading example. In this case, I would probably position those. When it gets too small, it's going to overlap whatever that content is. And we don't want that. That's kind of weird. What I really want that to do is to just concatenate those names down a little bit and give me some ellipses to let me know that it's just overlapping. So you can do that in normal CSS, the way we currently do things. It's a little bit weird, but you totally can do it. So if I was doing that in Flexbox, again, this is kind of what I would have. We'll ignore the user portion because we've done that like a million times. For the name itself, here's where the magic happens. We're going to set that to flex 1. Min width is very important. Flexbox, for whatever reason, needs some type of min width so that our text overflow fires correctly. So what that'll do is we're essentially taking the name. We're setting a min width of 0, and then we're setting our overflow to hidden. Our text overflow, we're going to have that just create ellipses for us automatically, which is kind of magical that CSS does that for us. And then we're setting the white space to no wrap. So whenever it resizes, the text isn't going to bump down to the next line. It's going to stay a single line, and it'll concatenate that down for us. And the only thing we need to do with our actions is we set that to display flex so that everything's in line. And because of the way Flexbox works, it's looking for our name and our action, and it notices when they bump up against each other. So whenever the name begins to decrease and the name isn't long enough to show up, we'll just get dots, and it'll just start replacing letters with dots, which is pretty cool, right? So, nifty Flexbox tricks. Another one is tabs. Now, typical tab setup, here's the markup. We have a tab wrapper, we have a tab itself, and then inside the tab we have some type of an action, which is the thing that we click on. Now, typical tabs look like that. We typically take an ordered list, we float those to the left, or do a display inline block, and we kind of get tabs. What I really want is something a little bit smarter. I kind of want my tabs to always go the full width of the parent that they're in. So doing that with floats and trying to figure out like how to make that work when I don't really know the number of tabs that are going to be there or the length of the text inside the tabs, it's kind of hard. So here's how we would do that in Flexbox. And it's ridiculously simple in that we have tabs, we're doing the same thing we've been doing forever, and then our tab we just set to flex 1, and it's just going to always fill up the width of that space. Pretty magical, right? Okay, so you might recognize a little bit from this morning. So we had this card example. Somebody had the question of, instead of making those cards towards the end always be the full width and kind of adjust that way, what if we just wanted to do something kind of like this? I added one extra thing, which is some type of an action. So 2 things that I want to be able to do with Flexbox. One, I want the cards to lay out like you see here, but in the case of the content inside, the description of that card varying, I always want the button to be on the bottom of the card. So this is the HTML that we have. We have a card, and then inside that card, the thing that we're going to focus on is the card action. So I want the card action to be at the bottom of the box or the bottom of the card all the time, regardless of how much descriptive content we have in there. So here's what we do. Again, we set the card's parent to display flex. We're going to set this to wrap, so it's not going to try and squish everything into a single row. And then the thing that we're doing differently this time versus the example from this morning is we're just going to set justify content to center. So regardless of how many cards we have, that last row is always going to be centered. Right? Pretty easy. That's the way to fix that. For the card itself, right now we have it locked in to show me 4. So I'm setting my flex bases to 20%, and that's going to give us kind of a max of 4 per row. And then the weird little magical thing is for the action. Flexbox is kind of weird in a smart kind of way. The only thing I have to do to the action is set my margin top to auto, and Flexbox just kind of knows that it's going to fill up that space. I'm not quite sure how it knows to do that, but it knows to do that, and that's what it does. It's weird. The alternative way to do that would be to take your card and take your flex direction for your items, and then set the justification a little bit, and set this bottom action to just sit towards the bottom of the axis. So that's the card example. Pretty simple, right? Not too crazy. Now, to note, there's some stuff that we're missing, which is all the visual goodies to make it look like it does. This is the structural stuff needed to lay out like it needs to. So if you try to put this in CodePen, it's going to work. It's going to be really ugly. Okay? So those are kind of all the examples that I have. So we have time for some Q&A, and then we'll let y'all go home.
Why is it 20%? Wouldn't it be 25?
It's kind of weird. 25 doesn't work. So that's, Flexbox is weird sometimes how it's calculating. Yeah, it makes sense like it should be 25%, but it's kind of weird. I don't have a good answer for that one. Yeah.
I think it's because if there's any sort of margin at all, 20% won't be able to fit 5 objects.
Yeah.
So by putting 20, you're saying if you even have 1 pixel margin, you only have 4 objects.
Maybe. Well, Flexbox is kind of smart, I think, in the way it handles margins and paddings, and that it, when it's trying to fill up space and calculate the width of the cards, it kind of takes all that into account and does the stuff for you. It's
Perhaps a decimal rounding?
maybe. Who knows? Yeah.
At compiling time, are you compiling ampersand action because it's pre-compiled, it doesn't?
Yeah, that's a good point. So all the CSS is Sass. I should have mentioned that. So one of the things that I'm using just to kind of keep this a little bit simple and save a little space is I'm using Sass. So if you're not familiar with Sass, the ampersand is something called a placeholder, or a parent selector, sorry. So what that's going to do is when it spits out the CSS through the preprocessor, it's going to spit out .card-action. That's what we're going to get. So in all those examples. What other questions do you have?
So action is actually a class? Or
Action is going to be a class. So it's going to be our button down there. It'll actually give you, there we go. It'll give you card action right there. That's the class it'll give you. Any other questions? Yeah, one in the back.
What are some of the known issues for I-10 and I-11?
So I-10 and I-11, some of the issues. So one of the issues is I-10 specifically is using some of the older prefixes of Flexbox. So it's not really a functional issue more than a maintainability issue. If you're using a post-processor or like a pre-prefixer, I guess, it handles all that for you. If you're using something like Sass, or even less, or Stylus, a lot of that's handled on the fly. If you're using post-CSS, you can tell it what prefixes you need, and it'll spit those out. So if you're using Flexbox on I-10 or I-11, you can specify in what it's post-processing and what prefixes it's going to give you to make sure it works. Other than that, they're missing, I guess, some of the newer things that have come out in the spec. I haven't tested any of this stuff in anything IE because I don't care. Thank you. No. I know Microsoft is here somewhere, but no, I mean, IE is doing a lot better, right? I don't think they're here for sponsoring y'all, are they? Nope. Okay, no. So IE is doing pretty good. The Edge is doing what IE10 probably should have done years ago, and implementing some of the newer specs.
Do you have any good or creative examples of Flexbox on the web right now? Any websites that are currently using it?
Probably, but not in my mind. Yeah, so there are companies that are beginning to use it more and more often. Even some of the updates to something like, I'm not a Bootstrap fan, but it's pretty good. Like there's some good stuff in there. Some of their stuff is migrating over to Flexbox. Like as far as big companies or folks that are doing like larger design systems, I'm sure there's some out there, I just don't know what they are. I'm sure they exist, though. They totally gotta. Anything else? Okay, one more. Sorry? No. So there are some systems or some grid systems that are preprocessor based, whether it's SAS or LESS or stylus, that will generate Flexbox and generate the floaty version of that. It gets kind of heavy-handed. So if you want to use Flexbox in this way, and you also have to support IE9, I would think really hard about it. But I mean, you can totally make it work. You would have to just rewrite the same thing twice, which is totally doable. It's just not, I wouldn't want to maintain that personally. All right, cool. So you can find me online at Bermon Painter. That's my Twitter. It's also my Gmail. It's also my Skype. So let me know. I also host office hours every Friday morning from about, 8:30 to 10 o'clock. It's all online, all remote through Office Hours.io. So if you're tinkering with Flexbox and you get stuck or have a question, hit me up. Thanks, everybody.